Welcome to All Home Care Matters, the show where we discuss all things home care, with discussions on important age-related matters and topics. Brought to you by Enriched Life Home Care Services, the #1 rated home care provider in Michigan by Top Rated Local.
Hello, and welcome back to All Home Care Matters. If this is your first time visiting us here at the show, we want to say thank you for taking time out to be with us today. We appreciate how valuable everyone's time is, and that's why we try and make each episode here at All Home Care Matters something that will hopefully matter to you. Today, I have the distinct privilege and honor of welcoming two guests from the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, Esther Kane, who is the Director of Support and Education, and Debbie Elkins, who is Ambassador and Family Caregiver for someone living with FTD. Welcome.
Thank you for having us. We're happy to be here.
Our pleasure. Our pleasure. You know, I really want to start off and again, from the outside, you guys are, boots on the ground day to day. Sometimes people hear Alzheimer's, they hear dementia, FTD. Now they're associating it with people, like Bruce Willis, who, came out and acknowledged that he's living with it in his family. What is the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration? Can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing and what the mission is?
Yeah. So the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, which we will call AFTD, is a nonprofit patient advocacy organization specifically focused on frontotemporal degeneration. AFTD was started over 20 years ago by a care partner who recognized the need for an organization, a nonprofit organization, solely focused on supporting those living with FTD, their care partners, their families, as well as driving research for a cure for this disease. And so now AFTD works to advocate for better resources, for better care for those living with dementia and FTD. We work to raise awareness of the disease because it is a little bit less common than other forms of dementia, and therefore it's very misunderstood and misdiagnosed. We also work to support families living with the disease through support groups, our helpline, and other resources, and then really work to drive research towards a cure, and not only towards a cure, but towards better care for every person who's living with the disease. That's a little bit about the association and what we do.
Yeah, thank you, Esther. Real quick, not to put you on the spot, do you happen to know the support line telephone number offhand?
We do. So AFTD's helpline is staffed by trained social workers, and all they do is FTD all the time. We receive, last year we received over 3,800 people who reached out to the helpline looking for support and information, whether you're a healthcare professional, so a person living with the disease, or a care partner or family member. There's people there who can help. The helpline, the phone number is 866-577-7222, or you can email us at info@theaftd.org.
Thank you so much for that. So that's the association. Now, how do you explain what FTD is to a lay person or even some educated people? We do dementia seminars throughout Michigan here in our state, and one of the most common things we encounter almost daily is my dad has Alzheimer's, but he doesn't have dementia, right? Or they think dementia automatically just means you have Alzheimer's. And, we explain to them there is a big difference. You can have Alzheimer's and you will have dementia, but you can have dementia but not have Alzheimer's. So how are you sharing and explaining what FTD is to, people who are already kind of have these misconceptions and preconceived notions in their head?
The dementia is the large overarching term for a change in cognitive function, executive dysfunction, language, and or memory. And that is the big, broad, overarching term for all of these changes that are occurring in the brain, causing cognitive changes. There are types of dementia. And so we have Alzheimer's disease, which is a type of dementia, which is caused by plaques and tangles in the brain that we know about. Then we have Lewy body disease or Lewy body dementia, which is caused by Lewy body proteins. And then we have frontotemporal degeneration or dementia, and that is caused by different proteins in the brain. But they all are affecting the brain in the same way that is leading to changes in cognition, executive function, and or memory. And so when we think about FTD, it's a type of dementia, with dementia being the big overarching term. Sometimes I'll relate it a little bit to how we talk about cancer, right? Cancer is a big overarching term that is caused by changes in cells in the body. But there's different types of cancer, right? And they're caused by different types of diseases. So, and I think it's really important that when we understand that, we better understand what's happening in dementia. And we do a little bit of a disjustice to those living with the disease and to their families when we don't help people understand these different types of dementia and what to expect, because dementia doesn't look the same in every person. Somebody with Lewy body dementia is going to present really differently than somebody with frontotemporal degeneration, or somebody with, maybe more vascular dementia. Their prognosis, the way the disease progresses, is going to look different than somebody who has a genetic variant of FTD at a younger age. And so the more that we understand the different types of dementia, the more we can better help support families. We can better understand the behaviors that we might be associated with the disease, and better support those living with the disease.
What are some of the common signs and symptoms of somebody with FTD?
So frontotemporal degeneration, it affects the frontal and temporal lobes of our brain. And the frontal lobe of our brain really controls our emotions, our processing, our executive function, and how we're thinking. And then the temporal lobes of our brain really control our speech and our language centers of our brain. So when somebody has frontotemporal degeneration, we say it affects personality. And I really want to highlight that, because we don't normally talk about personality changes as a form of dementia. We tend to think of that more as another type of mental health illness causing personality changes. But FTD causes personality changes, as well as changes to language and movement. There's three main subtypes of FTD. So we have behavioral variant FTD, and that's the more classic form of FTD that we see. That makes up about 50% of cases of FTD. And that's usually categorized by three of the following 6 symptoms. So apathy, an inability really to kind of get up and move. It can be misdiagnosed as depression, but it's not depression. The person's not sad. It looks very different. It's just as though they have no initiative. They just can't get started. And they very often, people will explain it living with the disease as though they just have weights on them and they don't know why. They feel fine, but they just feel like they have weights on them, making it so that they can't engage. Another symptom is disinhibition. So it's a very impulsive behavior. The kind of shield that we all have in our head that says, don't say that, that's not appropriate, goes away. And all of a sudden people say really inappropriate things. They'll walk up to somebody and be like, you're fat, out of nowhere. And the family's horrified. I can't believe they just said that. They never say that. That's so out of character for them. We also have a lot of compulsive behavior. So ritualistic compulsive behavior, similar to what you might see in OCD. And there's a loss of empathy that happens. That is, I think, one of the hardest things for families to deal with, because empathy is what really connects us human to human. And so when loss of empathy occurs and empathy is lost, you start to lose your relationship or your connection to the other person on an emotional level. Meanwhile, you're caring for each other. You're together all the time. And that loss of empathy is really changing that relationship. On top of that, we also have hyperorality, or there's a lot of fixation with putting things in the mouth or eating inappropriate things that can occur with the disease. And I feel like I'm missing one. Apathy, disinhibition, loss of empathy, compulsive behaviors, hyperorality, and I'm missing one.
Well, when you think of it, let us know, because, that one of the things that we are very fond of saying, and I'd love your take on this, and then I want to go to Debbie, regardless of the form of dementia, and yet, the symptoms are all different, and, there are some common themes, but some will be more, exacerbated than in others. But when you've seen a person living with dementia, you've only seen that person because of how widely and greatly it can vary person to person. A grandma who was very outgoing, bubbly, might become very reserved, shy, and meek and quiet, where a grandpa who was very quiet and reserved, now he's the life of the party. And, it's hard to explain that to families because they aren't experienced with it. And sometimes they'll just, grandpa's just being silly or he's getting old, but they're not really looking at, is there an underlying cause for why the behavior is changing so dramatically?
Yeah, we talk a lot about naming the disease and not the person. So when somebody's diagnosed, it's the disease causing the changes. It's not the person causing the changes. And very often, if you can separate the disease away from the person and blame the disease for what we're seeing and not the person, um, families can adjust a little bit better because they can kind of see that this isn't the person. My loved one's sick. They're having illness, and it's the illness that is causing all of this trouble in our life. It is not the person, because otherwise sometimes it becomes really hard to care for somebody with the disease with these particular types of symptoms because it is so isolating and it alters the relationship so much when there's cognitive changes that are occurring.
Right. Great point, Esther. And I'm glad you brought that up. Over the years, we've had families where the granddaughter would go and spend the day or the afternoon with grandma and grandpa. Grandma might be living with a form of dementia, and she's, yelling at the grandchild and just being, really rude and almost very curt. The granddaughter's traumatized. Why is grandma? What did I do to grandma? And we explained to the families, what, that it's still grandma, but it's the disease that's acting that way, not grandma. And it does help to almost help it resonate a little more when, the boogeyman, so to speak, is now the disease, and it's not grandma doing that because she's just a mean person. Grandma may not be able to really, help it. And so it helps them with the coping and kind of the setting those expectations for what could be a long journey as well. So
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought that up. Next, I want to go over to Debbie, who is one of the ambassadors for AFTD, also a registered nurse, but almost probably most importantly, you're living with it day to day, caring for a loved one, Debbie. What is it like to live and care for somebody with FTD?
Well, it's definitely a challenge, and every day could be completely different. It definitely has changed my relationship with my husband, and it's taken a while to arrive at a place where I'm able to, like Esther said, to recognize that he's still my husband. He's still the same person that I married nearly 40 years ago, but it has shifted from one of where we have a mutual partnership or we're both working on our relationship, our home, our lives, to one where I am the care partner and the caregiver, and he, while he's still my husband, and I respect that and show that love and respect, he's more like one of the grandchildren. He truly needs the direction of, you know, it's mealtime, it's time for whatever. I can't just allow him to take care of himself. I'm now the one who carries not only the partnership as a whole, it's the, getting the physical things done around the house. Things that he used to do now are added to my daily life, and taking care of him and seeing, that he's getting the medications that he needs. He is still very functional, and I'm grateful for that. But it has definitely shifted to one of where I carry the mental burden, the physical burden, and it's almost like being a single mom with an adult male husband. So I can say that once I shifted from realizing that it was okay for me to let go of checking with him, you know, and to one more of where I'm the one in charge, much like you wouldn't just let your child go and pick out whatever he or she wants. You give a few choices, and you I guide him. Currently, that's where we are in our FTD journey. It will eventually shift even further to where, I'm not just guiding him, but I am completely taking care of his every need. Right now, I'm more guiding him, keeping him safe. Um, and I think that's the hardest thing, is to take a step back and recognize that I'm really not asking you to take a shower today. I am guiding you that this is what's going to happen. And when I have pushback, instead of it becoming an argument or, well, it's because, I no longer explain things because he doesn't have the capacity to process that information. So instead of wasting a lot of my time butting heads, whatever needs to be done, I guide him in that direction and have just stopped butting heads with him. I'm really working on recognizing the God winks in all of this, or the positive aspects, however you want to look at it. I don't think that we are in this situation without having a lot of positive things that are occurring. And I'm trying to see those things on a daily basis and hold on to that instead of holding on to the things that we can't do or the things that he can't do, or, because you can really get caught up in the negativity of being a care partner and a caregiver to someone with a disease like FTD that has no treatment and no cure. So we're circling the wagons. We are sharing our journey with those that will listen, because I truly believe that by doing that, it will lift everyone up. The more people that know and are able to understand, then the more we're able to not only bring awareness for frontotemporal degeneration and what it can do to a family, but also those people will love him and in turn, love us and help support us through this.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is fair, but we encounter a lot of healthcare professionals, nurses, doctors, social workers. They know what dementia is, but they don't understand how it works, so to speak, very superficially. Being a registered nurse yourself, Debbie, how equipped did you feel you were for when you and your husband received that diagnosis? Right.
I don't think that I was equipped.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody's ever equipped to receive a diagnosis like FTD when you expect that, you're empty nesters now, you've got 6 grandkids, he's going to teach them to fly fish, and, we're going to take vacations. And, I don't think anybody's equipped not only to see your life shift from what you had envisioned or hoped that it would be to one where you have to explain to the grandson why playing with that basketball was okay for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but now it's not okay because he's reached his threshold for what you were explaining, while grandma is suddenly not happy. And that's not him. Like Esther said, who he was and who he is now are 2 different people. And being a registered nurse could never have really prepared me, other than I am a caretaker by nature, which is why I became a nurse.
Right.
I am stepping up. I'm here for the long haul. I'm here to do the work. He's my husband. And instead of making this a miserable experience to the end of what it may be, we will chin up, buck up. This is what we have to do. I did suffer through and still suffer through the stages of grief. I went through 2 or 3 months of like, what does this mean? But at some point, I think maybe the difference between me and someone else is I got up, brushed myself off. I need to educate myself. I need to link arms. I want other people to know when someone mentions, oh, it might be FTD, where they should turn to get support and education, and that the AFTD was the place for anyone with this diagnosis to be. And so that's why I'm here today. I think that, the nurse in me is maybe somebody that says, hey, wait a minute, we have an emergency. You got to get up and fight. You can't just lay down here and, let this roll over you. So,
Debbie, how common is FTD?
well, I like to say that it is a rarely diagnosed disease. I think they do classify FTD as a rare disorder, but it is, I believe, one that is rarely recognized, therefore rarely diagnosed. And I think that it's more common than maybe what anyone knows at this point. It is the most common form of dementia for those that are diagnosed with the dementia under the age of 60. And, we are seeing people that are in their 20s that are diagnosed with FTD. I am learning so much about this disease that I never wanted to know anything about. But it can take many years to reach a diagnosis, a proper diagnosis, which was true in our case. We started noticing changes probably 6 or 7 years before we eventually came to find that this was frontotemporal degeneration. And it was 4 years from when we saw our first neurologist. We went through 4 neurologists and a diagnosis of Alzheimer's before he had a spinal tap that proved that it was not that. And it was a journey for sure. But many people are diagnosed with depression or Alzheimer's, or even potentially seen as being psychiatric instead of a neurological disorder, because as Esther had said, so many of the changes that are seen in FTD are things with behaviors and personality, and somebody in their 20s who is exhibiting disinhibited behavior, stealing things, getting arrested. And so it was true in our case that we went through a psychiatric workup before we eventually arrived at the FTD diagnosis. So it is not a common diagnosis. I think a lot of times people are accepting that, oh, your husband has dementia and we're not quite sure what it is. And in my case, I listened to that for a while, and then I said, I need to know, what is this? And just kept pushing for a diagnosis. And I think that that's important for others to try to reach something beyond just the umbrella term of dementia, because there are different treatments available. Alzheimer's is one thing that does have some treatment.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you mentioned, the difficulty with grief. I often find one of the hardest parts of having a diagnosis of dementia and other illnesses too, but I think especially dementia, is that anticipatory grief. You're saying goodbye almost before the person's gone in many aspects. I want to, before we go back to Esther, tell me what the AFTD has meant to you and your family, because you're now an ambassador, and I can't imagine, what it must have been like, kind of going at it on your own, and then you find this wonderful organization, and now you're here representing it as an ambassador. Walk us through that and what the benefits have been and the support to you and your family with AFTD.
Well, it definitely was like a light bulb came on for me when the neurologist mentioned, I think your husband has FTD. And being a registered nurse and having never heard of FTD, I took the month of waiting for him to get the MRI and the follow-up to start researching what is FTD. And of course, I found so much on the internet, but when I landed on the AFTD's page, and particularly some of the tools and documents that are there, specifically the diagnostic checklist. And I'm looking at this diagnostic checklist and all of the things that I was trying to find the words to explain to a doctor or a neurologist. It was all there on a document, and I was like, oh, yep, 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 yep. And I thought that I would have to go back and convince this neurologist, my husband does have FTD. The MRI was pretty impressive. And it was an MRI that was 4 years from the previous MRI in comparison. So even I could see that there were massive changes to his brain. But what I couldn't verbalize were things that I was able to find on the AFTD's website, and then just exploring through all of that information and realizing that this is a whole different ball game from Alzheimer's. You know, this is why my husband, who is a younger, he was in his late 60s at the time, not in his 20s, thankfully, but there are those out there. But finding all of this validating information and education and research articles and just a vast wealth of support and validation for me, I knew that I needed to find somebody in West Virginia who was also maybe a volunteer with the AFTD. And when I realized there wasn't one, I raised my hand and said, you know, let me help get the word out, because at our discharge from the neurologist's office, when he was told he had FTD, we were told two things on the discharge paperwork: contact the association or the Alzheimer's Association and look into the AFTD website and study. And I thought, why aren't we talking about the AFTD? You know, more people need to know. So it's been my sort of drive to volunteer for the AFTD, to make sure that other people who are in our shoes, and I feel like we are diagnosed with FTD. Yeah. It's not just him. Absolutely. It's me. It's the whole family. It's our adult daughters, our grandchildren, anybody that knows and loves us. We all have FTD, and we're all here to support Chuck. But the AFTD needs to be a resource that's given to anyone who has, even potentially has the diagnosis. And so that's been extremely important to me, and part of my drive for volunteering. I was the first volunteer in our rural state. I was asked to be an ambassador, and I felt like I've made this comment before. I felt like I was asked to drive a car before I really had been given driving lessons. Like, I'm just now learning all about FTD myself and AFTD, and I want to volunteer, and so I'm still a baby in this organization, but I am very passionate about anyone who even thinks that their loved one may have something besides Alzheimer's or one of these other dementias, to go to the AFTD's website, find some of the diagnostic checklists and education, the webinars that are available on their YouTube channel, the grants that they give to people to help with respite, and travel to their education conferences, which, by the way, are really a must attend for anyone who's been diagnosed in the family.
Well, Debbie, thank you for sharing that, and I think you are such an added value asset to AFTD, and I know Esther's nodding her head yes, and I just, going to Esther now, I really stop and wonder too, and Debbie, you might have an opinion on this, even though your nursing degree license didn't actually make you a practitioner for somebody with FTD or dementia, do you think your clinical understanding and background helped you to further pursue a more accurate diagnosis? Because I'm wondering, if I'm a lay person and I have no healthcare background, you trust the white coat. The white coat says I have this, I'm leaving there with that, and we're going to deal with that. I'm not going to then go and continue pursuing a different diagnosis. That's kind of terrifying also.
Yeah, I think that's a societal issue as well, that we, or a cultural issue, I'm not quite sure which, but, to trust that, well, we don't know what you have, and, we haven't, all of his neurocognitive testing seemed okay, and, but I don't know that it was the clinical background for me as much as it's my personality.
An instinct.
Instinct, whatever you want to call it. I believe that we should question, we should assess information that we've been given, and we should try to arrive at something that fits what we're seeing at home.
Yeah.
Because what the physicians, no matter their testing abilities, their questioning, they had no way of understanding what we were seeing, or what I was going through with him. He couldn't explain it, because if you ask him, he's perfectly fine, and to this day he has no insight into, other than he knows there's something wrong in his brain, is what he'll say. There's something wrong in his brain, but beyond that, he can't hold on to what his diagnosis is. But for me, it was not okay to not have a diagnosis that was fitting what I was seeing he was losing, which was his executive function. How he couldn't just go out and grill a pan of hamburgers because there were so many steps. How he was having trouble with his working memory, self-monitoring, his confabulation. I thought, what's going on with my husband that he's not telling the truth? So it wasn't the fact that I was a nurse as much as I was maybe that person who needs answers. And I think too many people are not those types of people. They really don't want to know. They don't, they want somebody to say, oh, everything's fine. Oh, okay, everything's fine. We're going to go back home and pretend like everything's fine when it's not. So,
yeah. I totally agree. That's okay.
Question.
That's all right. Esther, let's go back to you. After hearing, Debbie's story about the multiple different diagnoses, a good friend of ours, Ian Kramer, he has a saying, even though he said he didn't coin it, I always credit him with it, and it's diagnose and adios. In countless families that we encounter professionally, and to an extent, Debbie's story, that's really what it is. You get a diagnosis and, it's like adios. How do doctors diagnose FTD? How do they get it right? So yet another family and their loved one, because it's traumatic for the loved one too, they have to go through all of these tests and procedures and, lumbar punctures. And how does a doctor accurately and, kind of unequivocally diagnose FTD?
So right now, we can't unequivocally diagnose FTD without a brain autopsy, and that's the only time we can make an actual confirmed diagnosis. There are no confirmed biomarkers in FTD. So the diagnosis that we get to in FTD right now is really a clinical diagnosis, and it's based on the symptoms that we're seeing. So are there clinical symptoms that are indicative of FTD? And then there's neuroimaging that goes on, where is the damage occurring? Is there changes happening in the temporal and frontal lobe of the brain? So MRI, CAT scan, FTG, PET, if we can get it, will help to get a probable FTD diagnosis, whether it be behavioral variant or primary progressive aphasia, corticobasal syndrome, or progressive supranuclear palsy. And when we're looking at this, there are other things that we're learning more and more. So on brain autopsy, we can see the pathology, and that's what can help confirm for us that we're seeing either, TDP43, tau, or FUS in the brain. And that's what confirms the actual diagnosis. I will say that in about 20% of cases, FTD actually is genetic and it runs in families. So many families not only have a spouse with FTD, but then they soon to find out that they then have children with FTD or in-laws. We have a lot of large families that work with us as an organization to kind of combat this disease because it affects so many members of their families. So the most common genes right now in FTD are there's GRN or progranulin, we have MAPT, and then we have C9orf72. Right now, though, there is hope. So there are current clinical trials happening in FTD, and right now they are specifically for those with the genetic form of the disease. So the current clinical trials, they're looking and recruiting people with a GRN, genetic variant of the disease. And the trials are looking very promising. I mean, more than ever, there's hope that we are getting closer and closer to a cure for this disease. But before families can even think about getting genetic testing, they need to pursue genetic counseling and really understanding what that implication is for them and their family, for them to undergo genetic testing and to learn more. But more and more families are taking part because of the hope that we see on the horizon right now in FTD. So long story short, diagnosing FTD is not easy.
Not easy. And what if somebody listening or watching this is, hearing Debbie's story and they're thinking, I never really thought it was Alzheimer's. I never really thought it was a type of, schizophrenia or whatever. How many people, is there any studies showing how many people may have been misdiagnosed with one form? No.
There's not studies showing it, but we see it all the time. I think the diagnostic checklist that Debbie talked about are so important for this very reason, because what we see a lot is that people don't know how to verbalize what they're seeing, right? They don't know how to verbalize this loss in executive function. It's a terminology that is not used in everyday language. And so when they get the words to be able to put it down and to be able to say, wait, like Debbie said, check, this makes sense. This is what I'm seeing. They're able to go to their doctors and have a better discussion. AFTD also has a website where we list medical diagnostic centers with specialists in diagnosing FTD around the country. Behavioral neurologists are your best bet in terms of getting an accurate FTD diagnosis. But very often community neurologists are diagnosing FTD right now because, as we all know, in a country where dementia is a little bit of epidemic, it's everywhere, unfortunately, and it's only becoming more and more of an issue as people age into in their life. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
That's
I was
okay.
going on a whole tangent there and I forgot what I was going to say.
That's okay. If you think of it, let me know. When back in the 70s, 80s, cancer was considered the C word. Right. I remember my grandparents talking about it. A good friend of mine now calls dementia the D word. How do you guys see society as a whole getting past that so we're not afraid to say that word? Because I feel like it has such a negative connotation to it. And I think there's a lot of myths and stigma and, half-truths or untruths associated with it. How do you dispel that, Esther?
I think that, we have stigma around mental health in general in our country. And so because we have stigma around mental health, any cognitive change has stigma. Really, when we're dealing with dementia, we're dealing with somebody with an illness. They have a disease. And the way that we respond and treat that disease is sometimes a little bit inhumane compared to how we respond and treat other diseases. When we think of somebody having dementia, we sometimes cut off relationship from that person. And you'll talk to a lot of families and hear from a lot of people or extended family where, well, now they have dementia, so they can't, participate the same way. And I think by people with FTD telling their story and saying how this disease makes them feel, how the way we communicate with them makes them feel is so important to reducing stigma and creating an atmosphere and a world where we can look at people with dementia and treat them with compassion and empathy and, also give them quality of life and the ability to do the things that they can do well. Just because somebody has a dementia diagnosis doesn't mean they can't do all things. Right. They may have some limitations in some areas, but there's some things that they may still be able to do really well. And I think finding those things and supporting them in those things, it improves their quality of life. And when their quality of life is improved, usually the care partner's quality of life is improved because they see that person being a little bit happy, or bringing that person a little bit of joy brings them a little bit of joy in the process. So I think that this is a national issue in terms of how we treat people with dementia and mental illness. I think a lot of it too is just society in general over the last 2, 3, 800 years. I mean, if you think of Victorian times, there was a lot of social decorum of ways that we had to behave. And when people have dementia or, FTD or even mental health issues, and they behave outside of that, that stigma isn't new. This is a generational stigma that's existed in our culture for a really, really long time. And lack of empathy and lack of compassion are really the driving forces for that. So the more awareness we can bring, the more we can listen to people tell their stories, the more that we can treat every person as a human being, despite what they're dealing with, I think goes a long way in reducing stigma.
Absolutely. And, that's why we enjoyed. Go ahead, Debbie.
I'm sorry, Lance. I just wanted to tag on, quickly to what Esther said about, the stigma. It's also just a huge lack of understanding of what dementia, and particularly FTD. My husband does not look like he has dementia. Well, what does dementia look like? He looks like a regular 72-year-old guy out walking with me until something occurs. So I think it can be very isolating at times for those of us that are living with FTD because, people may not understand. He may say something inappropriate. He may do something inappropriate. He is disinhibited. He will walk up to people, not in a bad way, but in a helpful way. But, a 72-year-old man striding toward a woman and children in the parking lot, she's going to take a step back. He's just coming to help you with your children and your groceries. So because of that, and because we want to be, still out there and enjoying things and not holed up in our home, I do carry around awareness cards in my cell phone. And I am at times handing these out, not all the time, but if we're out and about and we are trying to live our lives and something comes up, this person has dementia. And in particular, I wanted it to have more information about FTD and the AFTD. So I put a QR code on here that can take people, if they have questions, directly to that. So, we do as a society need to not fear the D word. We need to learn more about it. We need to be more accepting. And we also need to be understanding that while they may look like they're doing okay, life can be a struggle for us and, give us a little bit of grace.
Yeah, well said. And I love the card idea. Our seminars that we do, they're generic more for just dementia as a whole, and they have the forget-me-not flowers on it. And we tell people when you go to a restaurant or you're out in public, have those cards handy, because if your loved one, maybe it's a man and he's walking in the women's bathroom, it could escalate a situation dramatically, but they don't know any better. So you hand it to the waitress when you sit down at the table, or, wants to, they're attracted to, fun young, children, and they're wandering over and trying to give them a candy bar. It's a very real situation, and just having that prepared can, help de-escalate an otherwise unpleasant situation. I want to be respectful of both of your times, so I just want to close with Esther here. And Debbie, thank you so much for all the work you're doing to raise awareness and, being vulnerable and sharing your story. I think it's helpful for others to know they're not the only ones going through it and living it alone. So I wish you...
Thank you for allowing me to tell our story. And
absolutely.
Thank you to the
Anytime you guys have an open door here, anytime we can help and support the work the AFT is doing, we're happy to do so. 2 quick fire questions for you, Esther. One, dispel the myth. Is dementia or FTD, is it hereditary? If grandma has it, that means I'm going to get it automatically.
Not necessarily, but maybe. So there is some dementia that is genetic. It is hereditary. And so you really need to know your family history. Ask the questions. I think everyone should know their family history, because if you know your family history, that's going to help you better understand what it might be. It's very often possible that the family history might have a psychiatric history or an Alzheimer's. Well, grandma had Alzheimer's. But then when you talk to people, they're like, her Alzheimer's consisted of loss of language, and she was 60 years old, and she still had some comprehension. And all of a sudden, you're like, that sounds more like primary progressive aphasia than Alzheimer's. So, you ask questions, learn your family history where you can. It's not necessarily going to be genetic. Not all FTD is genetic. Like I said, about 60% of the time, we have no clue what's causing the disease. But about 20% of the time, there's a known genetic variant that's happening there. And if you find out your genetic variant, if you talk to a genetic counselor, you may be able to participate in clinical trials.
Okay. And is there a cure for FTD, or is there anything that I could do to guarantee I won't possibly get it when I'm older?
There's not a cure. There's not a cure. I mean, we are seeing that good brain health is going to help everyone. It's not necessarily going to stop the disease. It's not a cure. It's not a prevention necessarily, but it could halt or slow down your ability to get the disease. And so practicing good brain health, exercise, eating well, participating in good mental health, reducing alcohol intake, all of those things are going to help our brains be able to kind of be healthier and reduce inflammation, reduce disease, and help us live a better quality of life. And it may not make it so that you never get a dementia, but it might push it a little longer down the road so it doesn't happen as earlier. And for some people, it might be a preventative factor.
Wonderful. In closing, thank you both so much for everything you're doing for advocacy, awareness, and support. Debbie, I think you're a remarkable ambassador, and you're living proof of the work, as Esther is the director of support and education. This is what we're trying to do, right, is to help these family caregivers and, support them through this journey. Go ahead, Esther.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to your whole audience, we're on a mission and a goal to make sure that every person that is diagnosed with FTD knows that AFTD is here to help them. So, to those listening today, I hope that you will remember us. And if you come across somebody with FTD, that you will send them our way so that we can help and walk alongside them in the journey.
Absolutely. And I was going to go right to that. Where do you want people to go to learn more, to sign up, to become involved? And we'll put it up on the screen and have it in the show notes.
Yeah. So go to our website at www.theaftd.org. And you're going to learn great information. You'll have access to our helpline, our grant programs. AFTD has awareness cards. We have provider letters, the diagnostic checklists. There's so many resources available on our website to get you started. And if you need to talk to somebody, just call our helpline and somebody's happy to talk to you and kind of walk with you through the journey.
Wonderful. Well, Debbie, Esther, thank you both so much. We're here to support you guys however we can, and we just appreciate, again, you taking the time to talk with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today here at All Home Care Matters. All Home Care Matters is here to help families as they navigate these long-term care issues. We invite you to visit us at allhomecarematters.com, where there's a private, secure, fillable form where you can give us feedback, show ideas, or if you have questions. Every form is read and responded to. And remember, you can listen to the show on any of your favorite podcast streaming platforms, or you can watch the show on our official YouTube channel. Just make sure that you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. We'd also like to say thank you again to the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, as well as Esther Kane and Debbie Elkins for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you next time here at All Home Care Matters.
Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us again on another episode of All Home Care Matters. To learn more about the show and to connect with us, visit us at allhomecarematters.com.